So, Dr. Krugman, let's look forward to this election we have coming up in November and what economic choices the American people will be making as they go to the polls. Give us your sense of how different these two people, that is Joe Biden and Donald Trump, are in their approaches to the economy.
Okay, so this is one of those cases where if you look at past experience, you would say, well, how much difference does it make? I mean, in a lot of ways, the economy of 2024 looks a lot like the economy of 2019, pre-pandemic. Full employment, fairly low inflation. It's worrying a little bit, but we're worrying about the difference between 2 and 3, not anything major. It doesn't look as if it has made a whole lot of difference who's in the White House. But if there's a Trump 2, then there's a lot of reasons to believe that it could be very different. What's amazing if you go back and look at Trump's first time in the White House was how little he did when all is said and done. Basically he got a moderate-sized tax cut through, sort of, period, end of story. There wasn't a lot else that went on. That's largely because there were institutional restraints. There were, they couldn't get stuff through Congress, couldn't tell the Federal Reserve what to do. That could be very, very different right now. And if you take seriously what Trump, former Trump aides are saying, it would be very, very drastic. I mean, Biden would do continuity. Biden, if he can do it, will do more, some further tax increases, some more green industrial policy, but probably not enough to make a huge difference to the macroeconomic numbers. Big differences in other respects. Trump, well, we know that one of his former aides has been talking a lot about rounding up millions of immigrants, supposedly undocumented, though it wouldn't be surprising if a lot of legal immigrants got caught up in the net as well and deporting. Huge economic impacts, huge disruptions to the labor force. Another, Peter Navarro, who's being interviewed from jail, but has said that Jay Powell will be fired within 100 days, and that we will basically have the politicization of monetary policy. And there's a lot of reasons to think that a Trump second term might see him become one of those autocrats who demands that you run the printing presses for his political gain. I mean, think of Erdogan in Turkey or something like that. It's huge uncertainty, but I think anyone assuming that a second Trump term would look like the first one with what ended up being fairly conventional economic policies, nothing, and the Federal Reserve keeping a lid on things, could be in for a very rude shock.
Picking up on your comment about monetary policy and Fed Chair Jay Powell, we had Ken Rogoff on, somebody you know well, a fellow economist. Yeah. And when I asked that question of him, he said the markets would not let a new President Trump do that they would react really strong in the Treasury markets, and he would not have that option. Is that plausible?
The markets would certainly react. We would probably see acceleration of inflation, a plunge in the dollar, but, how does he respond to that? I mean, again, if you look at much smaller countries with that are much more exposed to market pressure, like Turkey, authoritarian leaders have a habit of saying, well, the markets are wrong, and I'm going to order them to stop. You might be surprised at how much socialism, or at least in the sense of capital controls and other things that might happen. If Trump says to the Fed, I want a booming economy, I want you to roll the printing presses, and the markets respond by driving the dollar down and inflation up, he might well then say, well, I'm going to put on rules that stop that from happening rather than changing the policy. Remember, we've had one, since the immediate aftermath of World War II, we've had only one episode of price controls in America, and it was Richard Nixon, not some progressive Democrat who did it. So I think you want to be, I understand Ken's point. He thinks that the bond vigilantes basically would discipline Trump, but I don't think that's a safe bet.
What about the prospect of inflation? Obviously, tariffs tend to be inflationary rather than disinflationary. At the same time, both President Biden and former President Trump seem to like tariffs pretty well.
Well, there's a big difference. I mean, yes, both are doing tariffs, and Biden has not rolled back most of the Trump tariffs, which is politics. There doesn't want to be accused of being soft on China or something like that. But if you look at the new proposals, they're actually, although they both are proposing tariffs, they're very different both in the details and in the purpose. So Trump's view is clearly he thinks of trade as a zero-sum game. If we win if other people buy our stuff, we lose if we buy other people's stuff. And so he wants to put a ring around the collar. He said a 10% tariff on everything, and and maybe more for some other countries. That's not at all what Biden is doing. What Biden is doing is some selective tariffs aimed at what he perceives as strategic sectors.
And if I'm not mistaken, you generally support the notion we have to do, whoever the president is, something to have to do to prevent a second, as you call it, China shock, such as we saw really around the time of the WTO, in order basically to protect some of our workforce.
Yeah, it's not so much jobs in the aggregate. Sorry, I'm sounding like an economist there, but it's not so much the total employment. We're not having a problem, at least at the moment, with overall employment. But what we learned rather painfully from the first China shock was that sudden surges of imports can be disruptive in ways that a lot of standard economic models don't capture, although non-standard models do. They can disrupt communities. They can disrupt strategic industries. And particularly if you are doing what Biden is doing, which is to try to sell climate policy in part by saying it creates manufacturing jobs, the political basis for that is going to be undermined if it ends up creating manufacturing jobs in China. So, no, and this is look, China, I don't think the Chinese seem to fully realize, but they are having a situation of grossly inadequate domestic spending and relative to their production capacity, and seem unwilling to boost their own demand, and they want to dump both in the sort of common language sense and probably in the legal sense. They want to dump the excess production on the rest of the world, and it's not going to happen. We're not going to accept it. The Europeans are not going to accept it. So you have to do something.
And finally, Dr. Krugman, let's go back to what Donald Trump did during his first presidency. He certainly tried to cut back on regulation. As we talk to former advisors and even current advisors like Scott Bessent, who talks to Donald Trump fairly regularly, he says we will get greater growth, economic growth, because we will cut back on regulation. Is that wrong as a matter of economics? In fact, if you cut back on regulation, there may be other externalities that we don't like, but is it generally true if we cut back on regulation, we will get more economic growth?
Certainly not true necessarily, and there's just no evidence for that. There is, right? We just what's actually been impressive, if you look at the U.S. historical record, is how little difference any of this stuff makes to long-term economic growth. You just cannot see that that increased regulation, certainly that environmental regulation, has had a negative impact. And one of the things that's worth pointing out, particularly since environment is probably at the core of a lot of this, we talk a lot about climate change, as we should. That's an existential threat. But what people don't realize is the extent to which air pollution, to take the prime example, has relatively short-term economic costs as well.